Welcome to episode 30 of The Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. This episode is all about booms, bubbles, and busts. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. I can hardly believe that we've already made it to episode 30. It's crazy how time flies when you're having fun. Today, I'm talking about the psychology behind economic booms and busts. The first big bubble on record happened almost 400 years ago, and there have been countless since then. So why haven't we learned to avoid them? Why do we keep falling into the same traps over and over and over again? This is where the behavioral part of behavioral economics comes into play. This episode is really relevant today because of the current status of the stock market, which had a tumultuous 2018 to say the least, as well as the recent rise and fall of cryptocurrency. I will touch on both of those in the episode, but I want to put out some disclaimers first. Number one. This episode is meant to explain the concepts of the human brain that drive economic bubbles and what to watch out for now and in the future. This applies to everything from tulips to houses, .coms to beanie babies, and everything in between. Which leads me to the next and probably most important disclaimer. Number two, this episode is meant to have no political affiliations at all. It is truly about how the human brain makes decisions, which leads to fads and bubbles. If any statement rubs you the wrong way and feels political or otherwise inflammatory, I promise it's unintentional. There is no intention to offend or blame anyone. The episode and its content are purely explanatory. And three, this episode includes general statements and is not in any way advice for your specific situation. You should always consult with experts on your team before making a financial decision. Throughout the episode, I'm going to reference a lot of studies, articles, videos, and past episodes which go into greater detail on topics. While you're more than welcome to take notes as you listen, you can also find all the links and details in the show notes, which are both in the app you're listening to this on or on the website at thebrainybusiness.com/30 because, as you know, this is episode 30. If you're already a member of the Brainy Business email group, there's also a link in the email you received on January 11th when this episode came out. If you are not yet on the list and would like to be, visit thebrainybusiness.com and sign up for your free copy of my ebook, The 10 Behavioral Economics Concepts You Need to Know and How to Apply Them, or you can download the freebie from any other episode and you'll be automatically added to the list. If you're in the States, you can sign up by texting the word Brainy, BRAINY, to 345345. And again, the show notes for this episode are at thebrainybusiness.com/30. All right, let's talk bubbles. One of the earliest known bubbles happened in the late 1630s when tulip mania struck Holland. The price of bulbs went up, and before the crash, the value of a single bulb was more than 10 times the annual salary of a skilled worker. If converted to present-day value, it was equal to about $25,000 for an individual tulip bulb. We can look back on this today and say it's crazy, unbelievable that anyone would pay so much for a bulb that might not even bloom. But all the aspects that caused tulip mania 400 years ago still plague humans today. So, what causes a bubble? The basic economics is this. When excessive demand for an item drives the price up so far above the intrinsic value, it forms a bubble. Whenever the general population realizes the price is overinflated, and they will, everyone tries to get out as quickly as possible, causing the value to drop dramatically or crash. There are many behavioral economics concepts at play in the case of bubbles, manias, and fads. In this episode, I will cover optimism bias, overconfidence, herd mentality, time discounting, and emotions like envy and excitement. To really explain the behavioral pieces of bubbles, I'm going to use a much more recent example than tulips. This investment boom took place around 20 years ago. That's right. I'm talking about the Beanie Baby bubble. Beanie Babies were not of huge interest to stores when they first came out, and most of their interest was actually in hospitals. Believe it or not, the genius strategy of retiring Beanie Babies, creating scarcity, and increasing their value dramatically happened more by accident than anything else. I'm not going to dig into scarcity or value here, as they both have their own episodes already, but there are links to those in the show notes. Along with, if you're not familiar with the history of Beanie Babies, there are also some links to really interesting articles that go into detail about what happened in the 90s when those became a bubble. Upon launching the Beanie Babies line, everything had been fine at Thai, the company that owned them. Nothing stellar, but some reasonable sales of their understuffed animals. Then one day, after issues with a supplier in China, Thai discontinued a lamb named Lovey and received a lot of communication from angry customers, mostly hospitals, where little Lovey had become a staple. The company and its owner, Ty Warner, could have buckled down and stood behind their statements, saying something like, "It's not us. The supplier changed things, so we had to change." Instead, Ty made a small but brilliant move here, changing the framing of their message. And you can check out episode 16 for more on framing. Instead of calling it a supply problem, which customers hate to hear, the company told store owners Lovey had been retired. And the response did a complete flip. Disappointed buyers were suddenly delighted at the prospect that the Loveys they already had might be worth more than what they paid. Seeing this, Warner began intentionally retiring specific Beanie Babies. This created scarcity, and people started to pay $10 or $20 for retired beanies that originally sold for $5. And then the mania began. It was actually not started by the company, but by 4 women in Chicago who saw potential in retired beanies, though I'm sure they didn't quite expect it to get as crazy as it did. They started snapping up as many rare beanies as they could get their hands on and created excitement as they went. One woman who worked at a hospital would ask to be transferred to the gift shop at other hospitals as she finished work calls and would buy up their entire supply of Beanie Babies. This caused interest and word of mouth to spread like wildfire, fueling the beanie craze. Another woman got the contact information for a supplier in Germany and bought directly from them. Babies she bought for $7 each quickly sold for over $1,800 a piece. Her $2,000 investment in Beanie Babies from Germany were worth over $300,000 in just a few months. One of the 4 women placed an ad in a collector's magazine with a price list for retired beanies. Prices she came to mostly arbitrarily, marking them at $10 or $20 a piece. But prices quickly shot up from there as excitement caught on. Once Thai learned of the craze, they added fuel to the fire, continuing to arbitrarily retire beanies and tease upcoming potential retirements on their website, causing huge increases in sales. The stories and dreams of potential wealth and lavish retirements were built one $5 toy at a time. Everyone started jumping on the Beanie Baby train, and within a few years, it was estimated that 64% of Americans owned at least one Beanie Baby. This is pretty crazy when you note that the entire bubble of beanies lasted less than 5 years. While most partnerships were declined, including an offer from Steven Spielberg, Ty did agree to a deal with McDonald's to produce teeny beanie babies to be included in Happy Meals. McDonald's produced 100 million teeny beanies, which they thought would be enough for 5 weeks. Boy, were they wrong. They sold out in less than 2. People started buying Happy Meals 25 at a time and told the restaurants to keep the food. Stores began receiving more than 30 calls an hour inquiring about which beanies they had. One store in Ohio apparently instructed all its workers to answer the phone, "Good morning, McDonald's. We have the moose and the lamb." Everyone was sure they had valuable beanies that would continue to go up in price and that they could sell at a huge profit someday. It seemed there was no cap to how much a beanie could sell for as the prices climbed up to $5,000 or more for special beanies. Some couples fought over their beanie babies in divorce court, and small children were injured at events when beanies were brought out for sale. It doesn't take much to imagine, does it? Maybe you got a little caught up in this yourself. I remember my sister and I begging our parents to get us beanie babies and talking about how we were going to strike it rich, checking the price lists and digging through piles of beanies when we went to the store looking for some that were of high value just in case. But then, just like the tulips, it all came crashing down. A retirement was announced on that fateful day in 1999, and prices remained stable. A release of 24 new beanies were made on that same day, and it was overwhelming to investors, and sales began to decline. Very quickly, prices plummeted, and retired beanies were sold at 3 for $10 instead of the thousands they had recently garnered. Unfortunately, as with any bubble, the stories of those who lost were far more common than those who struck it rich. Like the General Hospital actor who invested $100,000 in Beanie Babies, which he thought would be a college fund for his 4 children. In reality, he lost every penny and apparently still has more than 20,000 beanies in his home. Yikes. Who did make a lot of money on beanies? Those 4 women who started the craze, of course, Ty and its employees, and a few others. In 1998, the company had over $1.3 billion in sales. The owner, Ty Warner, had a pre-tax income of $700 million, and every Ty employee received an annual bonus equal to their annual salary. Not too shabby. Now that you've heard the story, I'm going to break it down into its pieces to explain how the human mind works from a behavioral economics perspective so you can understand bubbles. As a side note, if you want to read more into the Beanie Baby story, I've linked in the show notes to some articles and a book, which is titled The Great Beanie Baby Bubble, Mass Delusion and the Dark Side of Cute by Zach Bissonette. The first concept in the brain that contributes to forming bubbles is our bias toward optimism. Even people who would classify themselves as pessimists have this tendency. A bias toward optimism is what makes people underestimate the chances that we will be in a car accident or get diagnosed with cancer relative to other people. Check out episode 12 on relativity to learn more about this. Even when we're told a statistic like 1 in 3 people are at risk of developing cancer, our optimism bias tells us it will not be us or anyone we love. It's 1 in 3 of those people over there, not us. On the flip side, we may say that winning the lottery is a 1 in a million shot, but we still think we have a good chance of winning. In reality, the odds of winning the lottery's grand prize is 1 in 292,201,338, according to Forbes. Really terrible odds, right? But we have a hard time not imagining what it would be like, and our optimism bias tells us that could be me, which combines with perceived ownership and makes you feel like it's worth the small risk to play. The same thing happened with Beanie Babies. At only $5 to get in, it seems like a much easier way to strike it rich especially when you're hearing about all the positive stories of people selling their beanies at a high profit. This is the concept of availability, which was the topic of episode 15. Overweighting the chances of winning is compounded by seeing stories of people doing well with beanies. And the news would likely be contributing to this at the time that the fire is really building up that bubble. And seeing the big numbers being paid for beanies makes it feel more real, tangible, and within our grasp. I do not think it's a coincidence that the launch of eBay and its growing popularity coincided with Beanie Baby mania. Being able to see the high prices and auctions, even if you're not bidding yourself, and if people don't pay the list price, can really add fuel to the fire. The anticipation releases dopamine and gets your brain excited about the opportunities. This creates a quick feedback loop, which gets people caught up in the hype of the bubble. This same story can be applied to any boom, from tulips to the stock market to cryptocurrency. Even when we hear the odds, they don't properly register in our illogical human brains. Which brings me to the next concept in a bubble: overconfidence. If you ever hear someone say, this something, whatever it is a surefire investment and there's no way it will go down, or it can never fail, or anything along those lines, consider that your bubble red flag. Unfortunately, that kind of thinking is simply wrong. Everything can come down. And when it does, it tends to come down fast. It doesn't matter how long it took to build. A crash can hit so quickly it makes your head spin. And it often does. The U.S. housing market is a great example of this. People said homes were a solid investment, and many reportedly guaranteed they would never fail. Unfortunately, things cannot go up forever, no matter how much we want them to, and nothing is beyond a crash. Our brains are trained to be overconfident and have short memories for crashes and their likelihood to impact us in the future because of optimism bias, availability, and relativity. But this is something to combat when investing in anything. We also get swept up in the hype because of our herd mentality, which was the focus of episode 19. I briefly mentioned the stock market in that episode on herding, but didn't want to get into it too much because I knew a dedicated episode would be coming at some point. This is probably the most closely linked and important concept to understand when it comes to economic booms, bubbles, and busts. So, if you have not listened to it yet, I would recommend starting there at episode 19 after you finish this one. If you've already listened to that episode, you may remember me explaining that people herd just like other animals do, and for much of the same reasons, mainly for protection. Animals that wander away from the herd are more likely to be attacked by a predator, so it's best to stay with the pack. When an animal is part of a herd, it is best to simply follow everyone else. If you do ask a question, it's after the fact. If a herd of sheep were all standing around and all of a sudden half of them take off running in a particular direction, what do you think the other sheep do? That's right. They run too. If they wait around looking for what caused the commotion, it's likely to eat or otherwise harm them. The individuals assume the others in the herd know something that they don't. And this is exactly what happens with bubbles and booms. If everyone is jumping on the train, you want to jump too. You assume they all must have done the due diligence. They asked all the right questions, and the stories they have told you about how safe it is and how smart it is are easy to believe. Look at everyone else. We all can't be wrong, your brain says. The advice here is to do your own research. Don't get swept up in the hype of others in the herd. Unfortunately, like many things, this is easier said than done. Many people have a hard time with this because our brains believe it's better to be conventionally wrong than unconventionally right. In other words, if you bet and come up wrong, but everyone else did too, you're much less likely to be ridiculed than if you went against everyone else and made a losing bet that no one else made. Let's say you were brought into a meeting of your peers with a large corporation that wants to invest in some smart companies like yours, but they're looking to see which of you are the best of the best in this group interview. You sit down and are shown a slide with a very simple equation on it. Say, what does 2 plus 2 equal? You are the 8th person in the group, and as each person ahead of you answers 4, 4, 4, you follow suit. Easy. There are a couple more rounds of this, and then another seemingly simple question. What color do you get if you mix red and yellow? You had an immediate answer in your head and were confident until the first person says purple with absolute confidence. Purple, you think? How ridiculous. Then the next person says purple, and the next, and the next. You're getting anxious now. You thought it was orange, but these people must know something you don't. It's almost your turn. What will you say, purple or orange? Studies have shown that up to 75% of participants will give an answer they know is wrong to go with the group. You might say you wouldn't do it, but in the heat of the moment, your subconscious hurting brain might take over and force you to say something you don't believe or invest in something you know is too good to be true to keep from being ridiculed. It takes strong will and conscious focus to be willing to go against the group, and it's even more difficult when those people are like you. So, people you want to impress or are similar to mean you will be more likely to go with the group than trust your gut instincts or do your research. This happens especially at times when you are less confident in yourself, which happens a lot in investing. If everyone starts buying something, many people think, uh-oh, I better buy that too. Because again, it's better to fail by making the same gamble as everyone else than by being the one person who went against the cumulative advice of the herd. And note who really profits on bubbles. For Beanie Babies, it was those first 4 women and a handful of others, but the majority of people lost varying degrees of money on their investments. When it comes to the stock market, if anyone tells you something is guaranteed to make money, run away. Even the experts get it wrong sometimes. People who spend their entire careers studying the markets. And consider this. Once something hits the mainstream and everyone knows it's a hot buy, it's probably past the point where you should have bought in. This is not a guaranteed rule, but if you're not right at the very center and starting the trend, often you're too late to really take advantage of something that is hot. Also, just because everyone says something is a good investment or the right buy doesn't mean you have to go with the herd. Sometimes you have to buck the trend and go against the grain, even when it feels a little painful. Warren Buffett is someone we can all agree knows how to invest well. He's made billions of dollars in his lifetime, and one thing he has done is not gotten swept up in the hype of the herd. When Buffett refused to invest in .com stocks back in the day, everyone laughed at him for being out of touch. But he has said he will not invest in companies where he doesn't understand the numbers or where the valuations just don't seem justified. And that was the case for .coms for him. And everyone laughed until they crashed. Buffett has a great quote when it comes to investing. This tip can help keep you from the herd mentality and getting accidentally swept into a bubble. He says, "It is wise to be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful." Now that we've covered optimism, overconfidence, and herding, let's move on to time discounting and how it contributes to bubbles. As I mentioned last week in the episode about resolutions, we are programmed to see the immediate benefits and risks and disproportionately weight them against future benefits and risks. In other words, we humans have a hard time understanding what something will be worth in the future and what's actually in our best interest. This is partially because we see our future selves as a different person. Saving money today is hard because it feels like I'm paying a sacrifice I will never see the benefit of. I get all the pain and none of the profit. It's the same with exercising or eating right. So how does this apply for bubbles? When markets start to fall significantly, like they've done recently, people start to panic. They become very short-sighted and focus on dollars they have right at this very minute. Some get borderline obsessed and begin to micromanage their investments, which is done emotionally and pretty much always a bad decision, but more on that in the next section. Here's the thing. A lot of people invest long-term in the stock market. While you may have short-term holdings and trades, many of us have our money there to help save for retirement, right? That's a long-term strategy. Over the long term, things fluctuate. I'm not going to get into a whole explanation of micro versus macroeconomics, but I have linked to a chart of the Dow Jones Index by month over the past 100 years. And you know what? While it fluctuates and has some pretty big downs, it is way up over time. While it's easy to be short-sighted and panic when you see numbers going down, try to remember that in many cases, this is a long-term game. Our tendency to be heavily motivated by losses means we're more likely to feel them and act to preserve what we have, even if it's something we never really had. Value fluctuates, and it's easy to feel as if you had the money and dream about all the things you could do with it. But in many cases, that's simply on paper. Let's talk about this in terms of home values. Say you bought your house for $300,000 and it's exactly how it was valued at the time. Maybe you check monthly to see how Zillow or Redfin estimates change. It's gone up a bit. Say it's now at $350,000 after 5 years. So you feel pretty good about your investment. If one day you logged in and it said your estimate was up to $800,000, you would probably feel pretty amazing. You might start planning for the future and dreaming of what you'll do with all that money. Vacations and financial freedom might be dancing in your head. You go out to dinner to celebrate. But then the next day you log in and see the value has come way down. It's only $400,000 now. How depressed would you be? Would you feel like you lost that $400,000? It might plague you for years or the rest of your life over all the things you could have done differently. This is counterfactual thinking, which I talked about last week. You might not even realize that your value is still way up over what it was for the past 5 years, $50,000 in this example, which it did in just a few days instead of 5 years like it took last time to grow that much. But you're now caught up in the emotion and might start thinking about selling or otherwise dwell over your bad circumstances. Your long-term investment has now turned into a short-term problem and mindset. Because our brains claim ownership over things very quickly, and we value things we own higher than things we don't because of the endowment effect, when there are projections or estimates of value, or our net worth is tied to those numbers, it's difficult to not get emotionally invested in the highs and the lows. But that is a trap you want to avoid as much as possible and try to keep long-term investments out of a short-term mindset. With bubbles, booms, and busts, we let our emotions get the better of us and we quickly become our own worst enemies. When we let our emotions drive the car, we sell too early as they go up and hold on to losing investments for far too long. Envy and excitement are two big contributors to bubbles. Think about the Beanie Baby craze. There was definitely a ton of both as the bubble was blowing up. Some people fought over their Beanie Baby collections in divorce court, and there were crime rings that popped up with a black market of beanies. Getting caught up in the excitement means you're less likely to do your own due diligence and that you might start to follow the herd for fear of missing out, as I've already said. This can be hard to recognize in ourselves because it's how we live our lives every day. And of course, most of this is happening on a subconscious level. This is what brings us to the ultimate advice to not get caught in a bubble. It's very similar to what I said last week on bringing this to your conscious awareness. If someone comes to you with an investment that seems too good to be true, it probably is. Do your own due diligence and have a constant gut check. Don't get caught up in the hype and allow yourself to make a big investment just because everyone else is doing it or because you're really excited. And while it may be hard, consider going against the herd and finding new opportunities yourself. Remember, the ones who win are typically on the front end. If everyone is talking about something and it seems super obvious, it might be a good sign of herding behavior and something to actually stay away from. One last concept for you to be aware of is called self-confirmation bias. It seems pretty self-explanatory, and it might not surprise you to learn that we humans have a tendency to confirm our own beliefs. So we look for information and statistics that support what we already think or want to believe. Even scientists working on theories who are trained to have an unbiased perspective do this from time to time because it's in our DNA. So, before you make a big investment in something, take a step back. Consider reading what the opposition says about it. And here's the key. Try to actually take it in. Yes, it's hard, but definitely better than finding yourself living with a harem of Beanie Babies 20 years after their bubble burst. Before I wrap this episode up, I want to ask for a quick and simple favor. As this is a topic many are interested in right now, and we all know people who could benefit from knowing this information before making a costly mistake, would you consider sharing it? Can you think of 2 people who need to know this information or would find it valuable? If so, please share it with them, either by grabbing the link from the app you're listening on, or encourage them to visit thebrainybusiness.com/30. Thank you in advance for taking the time. I appreciate it, and hopefully they will too. All right, that's it. Episode 30 on booms, busts, and economic bubbles is done. Next week on episode 31, we're back to behavioral economics foundations with an episode on mirror neurons. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.